Rosie, right, we're joined by Rosie right now. Rosie Birchard, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us just in terms of expectations of the South African budget speech. What are Europe's expectations?
Well, I think Europe really is trying to show itself as a reliable partner to South Africa. That's certainly what has been some of the rhetoric here. We know that the European Union has set aside 129 million euros for development in South Africa until the end of 2024, and one of the priority areas within that funding tranche is reducing inequality. So you can imagine these big questions around unemployment might come up there. But I think more broadly, what's important to note is that the European Union wants to move away from the narrative of donor and recipient when it comes to its relationship with Africa as a whole. But that's particularly relevant when it comes to South Africa, because of course South Africa is a member of the G20, which that group of the biggest economies in the world, where the EU is also a member. So in that particular group, they really sit round the table together. Now, more broadly, the European Union has put forward, last week they announced a new investment package for Africa as a whole. And the question that really came up there is whether the EU is a reliable partner for Africa. And I asked President Ramaphosa about that, and he said he's happy to hear about these new infrastructure investment opportunities, but he remembers what has not been done in the past. He made reference to climate financing, promises that have been made by wealthier countries in the past, including the European Union. And he said, we remember what has not been done. So the question there is really, how reliable is the European Union? And the European Union, of course, wants to show that it is committed to this relationship with South Africa. The EU and South Africa have what's called a strategic partnership. That is a special relationship between the European Union here in Brussels and another country or organisation elsewhere in the world. There are only 10 of those strategic partnerships, so it is seen as a very special and important relationship. So they will be watching this announcement carefully for those that work on this particular topic and that particular relationship here in Brussels.
Rosie, we actually have been playing that conversation you had with President Ramaphosa, but just in terms of the strategic partnerships, can you share with us the trade volumes between South Africa and the EU? Is other partnerships making an impact?
Well, I've spoken to officials here in Brussels, and they certainly see that kind of trading relationship with South Africa as a relative success story. So the key milestone in that trading relationship was in 2016 when the Economic Partnership Agreement, so basically a big trade agreement, came into force. That's an agreement with the Southern African Development Community region, so 6 countries, including South Africa. Between 2016 and 2019, so pre-pandemic, trade between the EU and South Africa increased by 20%. It peaked in 2019 at around 42 billion. Of course, then with the pandemic, that went down to around 34 billion in 2020. And we don't yet have the figures for 2021. But what is interesting is that it's a fairly equal trading relationship. So according to the last figures we have from South Africa actually exported more to the EU last year than it imported from the EU. So that shows that that's kind of a relatively equal trading relationship there. What officials also told me is that South African exports to the EU seem quite resilient, particularly agricultural exports. Some of the top exports from South Africa into the European Union are cars, and particularly agricultural exports, so particularly oranges, for example. Those exports have been going up even despite the pandemic. So the overall story here in Brussels in terms of that trading relationship is that it is seen as a relative success story. And of course, South Africa is one of the EU's biggest trading partners on the African continent, second after Morocco, and the EU is South Africa's biggest trading partner. So an important relationship, and one which certainly just from that trade perspective does seem to be going well, although we of course see stumbling blocks in those kind of political relations, particularly fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Rosie, thank you so much. And let's just touch on this question. What is the latest on Ukraine?
Well, this is certainly the top of the agenda here in Brussels. You know, we are talking about a big announcement in South Africa today, but it has to be said that is very much being overshadowed by this crisis in relations between Russia and the West. And the latest we have in Brussels is that EU officials are busy shoring up sanctions on Russia, and that is in response to Russia's latest move to recognize these breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine of Donetsk and Luhansk. We understand those sanctions are going to involve asset freezes and travel bans on hundreds of members of the Russian Duma, and they will also target banks that finance military operations in that region, and the EU is also planning to try and limit Russia's ability to raise capital on EU markets. So there's some quite hefty sanctions, but they've left some room for manoeuvre. They said they could have gone further, and that's so that they can, if things get worse, and of course they are potentially expecting a further incursion into Ukraine, they have more room for manoeuvre and can sanction further. Now, of course, Russia, we've heard this morning, says it's still open for dialogue. The EU says the same, but it's hard to see how they're really going to come together on these very difficult issues as the tensions really flare and escalate. We know one meeting between the French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, which was scheduled for Friday, has been cancelled. So a real crisis in relations here, and that is certainly something which is very much worrying EU member states, not least those EU members that share a border either with Russia or Ukraine or Belarus. They are very much concerned and looking at this with worry. This is something the European Union will be trying to monitor closely and potentially, as I said, up those sanctions in the future if there is a further incursion from Russia, which the EU sees as a blatant violation of international law. That's something, of course, that Russia would refute.
Thank you so much. That was SABC News correspondent Rosie Birchard in Brussels.